this one tonight. I was asking Melody earlier what's her favorite love story, and she really didn't have one. And so I was asking her, what was the name of that movie with Ryan O'Neal? And,
Love Story.
It was a love story. So should have known that. Well, we read about a love story last week with Abraham and Sarah that lasted for over 100 years. And tonight we're going to look at the beginning of another love story. I was heard about a couple that were engaged to be married, and as the marriage approached, both of them were getting a little bit nervous because both of them had a problem that they had never discussed with anyone else, and not with even with each other. And so the man decided that he was going to confide in his father. And so he went to his father and he says, "Dad," he says, "you know, I'm really getting concerned about this upcoming marriage. I've got a problem that I'm afraid might scare my wife off or cause our marriage to be bad." And the dad said, "Well, what is it, son?" He said, "Well," he said, "I have terrible smelling feet." And so the dad looked at him and said, "Son, that's not a problem." He said, "Just wash your feet as often as you can and wear socks. Even to bed, wear socks." And so that sounded like a pretty good idea to him. So he thought, well, that's what I'll do. Well, the girl, she decided that she would confide in her mother. So she went to her mother and she says, "Mama, there's a problem that I have that I'm afraid might affect our marriage." And she said, "Well, what is it?" She says, "Well, in the morning I have the awfulest breath." And the mother said, "Well, everybody has bad breath in the morning. What you need to do is, first thing in the morning, just get up and go into the bathroom, brush your teeth, and don't say a word." And that sounded like a reasonable solution to her, and so they both took the advice of their parents. Time went by, they married, wedding was a big festival or whatever, and everything went fine for about 6 months. Then one morning, just before daylight, the husband woke up and he found that he had lost one of his socks. And so he began to frantically search in the bed to find that sock. And that woke his wife up and she said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Oh no, you swallowed my sock." Some of you will get that later. Well, that is a love story. We all like love stories that have successful endings. So we're going to look at a love story tonight, the beginning of a love story tonight. And one thing that we'll see in this, we might get into the introduction in this, but that's probably about it. One thing you'll see as we get into this chapter is that the way that a man and a woman were brought together is a lot different than what it is today. Today we start our relationships usually with a boy will ask a girl out on a date, and they might, you know, go 2 or 3 times and develop into a relationship, and down the road maybe even get married. But in this time, in the Bible times, that wasn't true. And even in parts of the world today, it's not true that the man and woman make the decision, or the majority of the decisions on a marriage. Over in the Eastern countries, Middle Eastern countries, a lot of the decisions are still made by parents. And it has been that way for years and years, and has had some pretty stable societies through it. So we're going to look at this marriage, or this the way that Isaac and Rebekah were brought together. It says here in verse 1, "And Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of the house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh." Now that sounds like a kind of a strange request. It'd be like me asking Jerry I want you to put your hand on the Bible and swear to this. So that's basically what it is. It's a little bit more than a handshake, but that's the way they did it in these days. "And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. And thou shalt go unto my country, and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. And the servant said unto him, Peradventure the woman will not be willing to follow me into this land. Must I needs bring thy son again into the land from whence thou camest? And Abraham said unto him, Beware thou shall bring not my son thither again. Now remember, about 62, 63 years ago, when Abraham was 75, God had told him to separate. And so he's been gone from this family that he's wanting him to go back. And so now the servant said, well, what if they're not willing to come? Should I take him back there to meet him? And Abraham says, no, I want him to stay here in this land that God has promised. Oftentimes, we see God's promises, and we know that God's promises are true, and yet because it's not done our way, or we don't see it taking place, we want to help God out. Now, Abraham had enough foresight to know that this land that Isaac was in would be his and his offspring. It was promised to them by God. Abraham has grown into a man of faith, and we will see that just in a second with the words that he speaks, what a strong man of faith he's become. But he knows that if he lets Isaac go to another country, it's very easily that Isaac might get distracted. And instead of being in the land that God had promised, Isaac would be back in the land that God had instructed Abraham to separate, to leave, and go to a land that he would show him. And now Abraham is in that land that God has showed him. And so he tells him, don't take my son there. Notice verse 7. The Lord God of heaven, which took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, which spake unto me, and that sware unto me, saying, unto thy seed will I give this land, he shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. And if the woman will not be willing to follow thee, then thou shalt be clear from this, but my oath. Only bring not my son thither again. And the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master, and sware to him concerning that matter. Abraham had enough faith in God's divine plan, in God's promise, that he knew that God would be in this mission and would direct. And he told his servant that, do not take my son there, you go, and if she will not come, then you're free from this oath. But do not take my son from this land. The Bible tells us, well, let's ask this. Why was it that Abraham was not interested in getting a wife for Isaac from the Canaanites? He had lived with them. They had come to agreement. They seemed to be living peacefully. Why would Isaac, or why would he not want a son or a daughter, a wife for Isaac to come from the Canaanites? What?
Idol worshippers.
Well, they probably were idol worshippers. What were they back in Mesopotamia? Idolaters. Abraham himself was an idolater prior to God speaking to him and calling him out. So that couldn't have been the reason. One of the things that I believe makes a difference here is that Abraham wants someone with the same background and the same moral standards that he himself has grown up and taught to his children. Had he married into the Canaanites, there would have been a mixing. Oftentimes when warring tribes would make peace with one another, there would be two offspring that would be given in marriage, and marriage would be looked at as a merging of two families rather than just the creation of a new family. And so Abraham was afraid of having this Canaanite influence living in the land of Canaanites there in the very house, the very camp of his son. So I believe that's the reason that Abraham did not want to bring a wife from the Canaanites. God had told him to separate. And 63, 65 years have passed. And Abraham realizes that it's time that his son get a wife. Verse 10, and the servant took 10 camels of the camels of his master, and departed, for all the goods of his master were in his hand, And he arose and went to Mesopotamia unto the city of Nahor. Nahor was the brother of Abraham. Remember, we finished up chapter 22 by reading a little bit of the lineage of what was taking place back in Mesopotamia with the line of Nahor that we said would come into play in a very short period of time. Nahor was the brother of Abraham, the uncle of Isaac. Now, for Abraham's servant, and it was most likely Eliezer. Eliezer was a servant that Abraham acquired as he was passing through Damascus. It tells us in chapter 15 that he was very close. Abraham loved him. In fact, Abraham said that one here not born in my household would be his heir, and that was Eliezer. Now, we don't know for sure that this was Eliezer, but most likely that's the servant that Abraham had entrusted this to go in and to find a wife for Isaac. 10 camels at that time would be like 10 limousines today. Not everyone had camels. Camels were for the luxury. And the servant of Abraham took 10 of all that Abraham owned. We know that Abraham was a very prosperous man. God had blessed him with material wealth as well with the spiritual blessings. And so Abraham's servant takes 10 of these camels and goes on his way, and all that Abraham possessed was in the hands of Eliezer. We see that later in the book of Genesis with Joseph, when he's in Potiphar's house. Everything that Potiphar owned, he puts in the hand of Joseph because he trusts Joseph. And the same thing happened in prison. And the same thing happened once he became second in command there in Egypt. And he made his camels to, and he rose and went to Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor. And he made his camels to kneel down without the city by a well of water at the time of the evening, even the time that women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord God. Now notice, when Eliezer left, it doesn't mention that there was prayer taking place. But now Eliezer had made it to Mesopotamia, probably around a 500-mile trip. So it would have taken him several weeks to get there. And he has outside the city of Nahor, and he has come to the right place. So now he goes to the Lord in prayer. I've heard people say that Eliezer was not a believer. And I've heard people say that Eliezer was a believer. My personal opinion is that Eliezer was a believer. My opinion was that the household of Abraham was taught about Jehovah God and saw the blessings that God gave. I believe that Abraham, when he was blessed by God, made the whole household realize that this blessing came from God. And he made his camels to kneel down in the city at evening time that women go out to draw water. It was the custom in those days in the evening that the single women of the household would go out and draw water. And he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me God's good speed this day and show kindness unto my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. Let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink, and she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac, and thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master. And it came to pass before he had done speaking, that behold, Rebekah came out. Notice that Eliezer kind of puts a test to God here, but it's not a miraculous request. It's not one of those like Gideon, let me put the fleece out there, and if it's wet, then I know it's a sign of God. No, and he didn't say, let it be one that comes out in a purple dress with 2 different color sandals. He didn't say that at all. Really, what he was looking for is character in a woman. One that would be hospitable and would have character, and yet one who would be physically able or physically fit. And it came to pass before he had done speaking that behold, Rebekah came out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, and her pitcher upon her shoulder. And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well and filled her pitcher and came up. And the servant ran to meet her and said, "Let me, I pray thee, drink a little water of thy pitcher." And she said, "Drink, my lord." And she hasted and let down her pitcher upon her hand and gave him drink. And when she had done giving him drink, she said, "I will draw water for thy camels also, until they have done drinking." Camels who had traveled across the desert 500 miles, a camel can drink 30 to 50 gallons of water in 5 minutes. 10 camels. This maiden has a pot that carries maybe 3 to 5 gallons of water that weighs 30 to 40 pounds, and she is going to draw water to feed or to water these camels between 300 and 500 gallons of water. This is a lady that is used to doing some work. I mean, she has to be fit to be drawing that much water. And all Eliezer asked for was a drink for himself. And yet, the hospitality in her said, "I will water you and I'll water your camels as well." We're going to stop because we're past. But, come back next week to hear the rest of the story.